All right, so I think we're live. Don't know how many viewers we have just yet. Should be reasonable advertised. If anyone can hear me, please say so in the chat. Still 0 viewers. One viewer. 5 viewers. Okay, so we're going up. Yeah, so we're going to get started here. Just to make sure everything's working right, can people just say in the chat if they can hear me or not? Because if you can't hear me, that's obviously a problem. Sorry, just 1 second. Yeah, so can people hear me? We still only have 20 viewers. Okay, so it's now 9 a.m. It doesn't look like we have as many viewers just yet, but I'm sure they'll come piling in. We're gonna get started. So to those who don't know me, my name is Sam Shankland. I am a Grandmaster from the United States, and I occasionally do some work for Will and Freddie at iChess. And I recently came out with a series called the Shankland Method, which I really put a lot of work into. And this webinar is sort of giving you a little teaser of the kind of topics that I'm addressing in that series and the way of thinking that I'm trying to get people to work on, and that I hope will lead people to greater chess success. So just a little bit about me. I'm a Grandmaster from the US. I'm rated around 2678 FIDE now. So reasonable player, not quite at the super top elite like Magnus, but I have worked for him. The series itself is about using tactics and calculation to achieve positional goals. So for example, a lot of the times you'll see in tactics books, there'll be some 1 or 2, maybe 5 move tactic even, that will lead to like a win of a knight or some gross amount of material or lead to mate or things like that. And while obviously it's good to be seeing these tactics, because if your opponents make these mistakes, you want to punish them and you don't want to make those mistakes yourself. As you move higher and higher up the sort of the playing ability scale, you're going to find that inaccuracies often can be punished with calculation, but at the end of all of it, you'll end up with an isolated pawn for your opponent, or you'll have made some strategic advance or gotten the bishop pair or some relatively modest positional gain. So if you look at the games of players like Karpov or Carlsen or Gelfand or all these like really positional guys that come to mind who have seemingly a very deep understanding of chess, don't really have many sharp positions and stuff like that, you'll often find that even in these sort of quote-unquote quiet and strategic games that they're playing, there are a lot of tactics flying around, and they're going to see those tactics all the time and use them to their advantage. So my series is all about that, and I'd like to present a few games that I played to in my last tournament. I'll present a few games of that tournament today, really showing almost what I learned a bit while I was making the video course that I made. Yeah, we'll see some of those games now. It's following the same theme of sort of basically using tactics to achieve a positional goal. And one thing I'll point out is in my video course, I go through things pretty quickly, but I'm telling people to make ample use of the pause button. Since this is a live seminar and people are watching live and communicating with me in the chat, and I can see you all in the chat, by the way. It's just I'll wait on addressing stuff until we're actually into the chess. Because this is live and interactive, I'm going to be a lot slower here than I normally would be in the course, just because you don't really have the option to push the pause button the same way you do in the video course, which I think is pretty critical. So without further ado, we're going to get started. I'd just like to thank everyone for coming out, and to all those of you who decide my course is worth buying, thanks, you're awesome. So we'll get going here. I'm just going to turn off my webcam and switch to ChessBase. So that should work. You guys should see that. Now I need my chat window as well. Okay, so the first game we're going to show is actually the last tournament game I played. So this was, I think, 5 or 6 days ago. And it was against Vladimir Fedoseev at the St. Louis Winter Classic. And he was leading the tournament with 5.5 out of 8 at this point. We'll check some other games from the tournament as well, but we're doing a last round first because it was the most relevant one for the topic we have at hand. And given that I'm going slower and it's going to be interactive, I'm not sure how fast or slow we're going to be going overall. So the game started with c4, g6. I was hoping to play the Grunfeld, and this is sort of a clever move order, because if he plays e4, I'll play e5. If he plays d4, I'll play knight f6. And if he plays knight c3, as he played in the game, I'll play c5. And he cannot play a Maroczy bind, because if you're to go knight f3, bishop g7, and d4, then I will then here I will play c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight c6, and white was not in time to play e4 followed by knight c3. A little outside the scope of this stuff, talking about Grunfeld move orders, but in any case, we'll move forward. So e3, bishop g7, d4. I'm going to go through this part pretty quickly because we're going to try to get to the meaty part. So black can take on d4 here, but I chose to play knight f6 instead. After d5, we got sort of a reluctant Benoni, a tempo up. I was quite happy with my position at this point. And white was trying to play a tempo down Benoni. And while the Benoni I don't regard as a very good opening for black, a tempo means a lot. And here we'll see how I played. So basically, I think black's biggest problem in the Benoni is the c4 square for white's knight. So my whole plan in this game was actually not to take on d5. It was to leave these pawns here for as long as I could. So indeed, I continued with rook e8, castle, knight a6. And what I was hoping to do was claim that if white is unable to play the move knight c4, he doesn't have that many other useful moves he can play. And in the meantime, black's useful moves are pretty clear and obvious. He will play knight c7 and b6 and a6, rook b8. And then at some moment when white can no longer prevent b5, then black will play e takes d5 and expand on the queen side. So I was quite satisfied with this plan. I think it's much better than a traditional Benoni where we've already taken on d5. So my opponent played a4. And I had something of a decision to make, because this move really weakens the b4 square, and I can just jump in right away with knight b4 if I want. But the knight on b4, while it's nice and outposted, is not actually helping me achieve the b5 advance. So while it's certainly not a bad move, I chose to go to c7 anyway. Now I'm actually threatening to take his pawn on d5 twice. So he must play e4. So the game continued b6, rook e1, and now I played a6. And again, my point is pretty simple. It's what I've been saying before, which is that I want to play rook b8, maybe bishop d7. And once I've really made b5 impossible to stop, at that moment I will play e takes d5, so that when I play b5, the knight cannot get to c4. And black has got his typical queenside advance in the Benoni. Should have a great position. But here my opponent sort of saw that writing on the wall, I guess, and didn't want to allow this, and decided to force matters with the move a5. So we're going to stop here and take a break to give everyone a chance to think a bit about this position on their own. So you're going to hear me say that kind of thing a lot in the course, where you have to pause the video and sort of think of what move you would want to make here. Because while there's a fair amount of lecture-style stuff in the course too, in general, I don't believe that much chess improvement can come without actual interaction. Here, this is going to be an interactive lesson, so you'll have to actually pause the videos and think to yourself, what should black play in this position? So we'll just see if anyone has an opinion. And, well, I'm interested to hear what you have in mind. Let's see. Take as much time as you need. If someone wants to suggest a move in the chat, we can discuss it. So. No one has a move to suggest? How disappointing. Maybe not a move. What about just an idea? Things you notice about this position? Okay, so someone has suggested the move rook b8. This is a very natural move in a lot of ways. First and foremost, white is threatening the move a takes b6. That will win the knight. It's a serious threat. Now, it's one that's relatively easy to stop. So in the event of rook b8, several things are happening. Well, here black, next move, will probably play b5 if allowed. So white almost certainly is going to take on b6. That's his whole point of playing a5. And now we can assess this position a bit. And we find that black has activated his rook. There's no doubt that the rook is nice and active on b6. But the question is maybe how active is that rook? So it's kind of biting down on this pawn on b2. And more importantly, is black's whole idea was to try to play the move b5. And now that's never happening because this b5 pawn has been exchanged. If you think about this knight on c7 here, it went to c7, a reasonably not so impressive square compared to b4, specifically because black was trying to get the move b5 in. Since that didn't happen, now this knight on c7 is looking really clumsy. So for example, let's say white were to play a move like rook a3 or maybe rook a2. And my point with this move is I would like to play b3, and I don't want to run into any tactics on the long diagonal. And say white plays b3, and then he plays bishop b2 and queen a1. And he puts a lot of pressure on the long diagonal. He's putting some pressure on the a6 pawn, and black's pieces aren't looking very impressive. I think this is a pretty good Benoni for white. So while rook b8 is a very decent idea, in this specific position, I don't think it works very well. So going back, remember, what is the idea that black wants to play here? We've already discussed this plenty of times. I mean, if you could play any move you wanted and not worry about white's response, what would your move be? b7? That's illegal. Someone is saying b7. I'm not sure exactly what they mean. Bishop b7 is obviously not a good move on account of a takes b6 when the knight is simply lost and black's not doing very well. What about the move b5, though? When we think to ourselves, this is the move black really wants to play. It's the move that he has geared all his pieces toward. He has played knight a6, knight c7, a6. He really is trying to play the move b5. Now here, it seems like this square is insufficiently well protected because the bishop on e2, the pawn on c4, and the knight on c3 are hitting the pawn on b5. So it seems like black can't get b5 in. But this is something I'm going to say over and over again during my course, and it's something I'm really hoping to hammer home, which hopefully will be very useful for a lot of people, which is the idea that if you have a positional goal in mind, in this case, the advance b6 to b5, your opponent is preventing you from doing so, in this case by having more pieces on that square. The first question you should always ask yourself is, what happens if I simply do it anyway? Because you may find that there's actually tactical resources in the position that justify your move. So let's try to calculate b5. After b5, the pawn is hanging, but how is white going to take it? For example, if he were to play the move c takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, aiming to remain a pawn up, we find that the pawn on d5 is hanging. And at this point, black is probably just better with a nice big center. Does that seem understandable to everybody? Seems reasonably simple. But a bit more challenging is what will happen if instead of taking on b5, white takes on e6 first. By doing this, he is removing his d5 pawn, exchanging it off, the guy that was going to be lost, and now next move he is ready to take on b5. Can black get away with b5, or what should he do here? He has a very clever move, but he has to choose which piece he wants to capture on e6 with. Anyone have a thought? Well, let's start with the most natural capture, which would be bishop takes e6. This develops a new piece and puts more pressure on the c4 pawn. But it doesn't take that much calculation to realize this doesn't work, because after now c takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, white is a pawn to the good. We continue the line with knight takes b5, bishop takes b5, and now the pawn on a5 is hanging, but unfortunately black does not have the time to take it because his rook on e8 is loose. So for example, after rook takes a5, rook takes a5, queen takes a5, and bishop takes e8, white will remain with extra material in the winning position. So going back to this position after bishop takes e6, c takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, I think black's just in trouble here. He is down a pawn, and a pretty good pass pawn at that. If white can trade these knights and then play a6, he'll have a very strong pass pawn on a6 that black has essentially no compensation for, at least not as far as I can see. So that's definitely not what black wants. But then we're realizing the whole problem with this variation, going back, was here after a, knight b5, knight b5, bishop b5, all these trades happen. a5 pawn is hanging, but black's problem is that the rook on e8 is also hanging, which means he does not have time to take the pawn on a5. So going back a bit to this position here, what piece should black capture with on e6? So the whole goal is to make sure the rook is not hanging on e8. So yeah, I've seen several people saying we should take with the rook. So rook takes e6 is indeed correct. Because now, if white were to play c takes b5, a takes b5, knight takes b5, knight takes b5, bishop takes b5, white has won a pawn, but since the rook on e8 is no longer hanging, it has come to e6, black now can take a pawn back with rook takes a5, and here he has quite a pleasant position because he's doing because he's got the pawn back, and after something like rook takes a5, queen takes a5, black has a better pawn structure with more central control and more active pieces, and he's ready to play moves like bishop b7 and attack the e4 pawn. So this is very pleasant position for black. So indeed, going back to the initial line, all the way back here, there was a fair amount of calculation that had to be done to justify the move b5. But it turns out the pawn advance b5 does work concretely. Now we look at this position, and you might not think of this as a tactical move because it's like, well, you're not winning anything in particular. You're making a pawn advance. But b5 is a strategic goal that black has been looking to achieve. It's been very clear by the way he's played the game up to this point that it's a move he wants to play. And he had to use very precise calculation to make sure that it works. Now, given this, he has made a positional goal. He hasn't won the game. He hasn't, taken a whole bunch of stuff or material or blown up the white king. But he's achieved a strategic goal, and he's done so by calculating effectively. So we'll proceed on. So the game started with d takes e6, and as we saw, rook takes e6 was played. Now, white had some c takes b5 may have been the best move, actually, and he gets a somewhat worse position, as we saw. But I think white already has a difficult position. Instead, though, he played sort of a funny move, knight to b3. So what is white threatening with this move? He has sort of a clever idea. So I see someone in the chat saying, I most certainly would have messed this one up. You never know. Maybe you would have, maybe you wouldn't have. But my whole goal with these series is to get you to play better in positions like these. And I think if I can do that, if I can improve your play in this kind of position, it will be well worth my time to have done it. So yeah, someone is pointing out knight takes c5 is indeed the threat here. So if it were white's move, knight takes c5 would be possible. Let's say black just wastes a move with something silly like h6. Knight takes c5, and here white is won a pawn since d takes c5 fails to queen takes d8. So at this point, the pawn on c5 is hanging, and black has to do something about it. Does anyone have some candidate move they would like to suggest? Okay, so I've seen a suggestion of b4. That's interesting. Rook b8 has been suggested, queen e7, queen e8. So we'll go through some of these moves. So first of all, rook b8, I think, is simply a mistake because I don't think this addresses the move knight takes c5. So rook b8 does not work. Queen e7, that's a decent move for sure, but probably not best. Queen e8 as well. Queen e8, I would worry a little bit about bishop f4, which now attacks the d6 pawn and renews the threat of knight takes c5. Something like this is probably not really where black wants to be. So here's a simple question. We've talked a lot about what white has been doing. Yeah, bishop b7 I considered as well. Moves like bishop b7, f3, probably b4 now. You could also start with b4 and then play bishop b7 next. Knight a4. Now white would like to play knight b6, so let's say black plays knight d7. A position like this one, in my opinion, is absolutely fine for black. He has a backwards pawn on d6, but it's not very easy to target, and his pieces are nice and active, and maybe someday he can hope to play f5 and blow up the center. This position would not concern me. I think black's fine, but he has a better option. So at this point, so far, we've spent a fair amount of time talking a lot about white's ideas. What about black's ideas? I mean, right now, is there anything in white's position that's kind of hanging? How about this pawn on e4? Knight takes e4 is legal. That pawn is hanging on e4. Now, white is certainly not without counterplay, because after knight takes e4 and there's a trade, c5 will be hanging again, bishop f3 is in the air, so it's certainly not like white simply hung the pawn. It looks like there's a fair amount of calculation to do. But black would really like to play the move knight takes e4 if he can get away with it. And the first question is, in this case, well, I'd really like to play knight takes e4. What happens if I simply do it? So let's see if you guys can figure out. Can black simply take on e4 and say that white's play is not so impressive? So after knight takes e4, first of all, this move protects the c5 pawn, so knight takes c5 cannot be played right now. In the event of something like bishop f3, aiming to use this long diagonal and hit the rook on a8, it simply doesn't work because after knight takes c3, the white queen is hanging, and he's not in time to take on a8. And after something like b takes c3, rook b8, black is a pawn up and completely winning. So that wouldn't work. Now after knight takes e4, though, rook takes e4. Here the c5 pawn is still hanging. But as it turns out, white has to be pretty careful about the way he takes it. If he could play something like knight takes c5, rook e8, and I don't know, knight back to b3, I would think white should be okay here. It doesn't look so bad. But as it turns out, actually, knight takes c5 would be a horrible blunder because black can now win the game in one move. So let's see if anyone can find the winning tactic in this position. Yes, someone has pointed out rook d4. This breaks the pin that the queen is doing to the black queen. So now, after the queen moves, the knight on c5 will be hanging. For instance, queen b3, d takes c5. Now, white can retreat his knight, hoping to save it. But in this specific case, there is b takes c4, and the knight on d3 is lost, and the game is over. Black wins. So that, I think, is pretty convincing. But it's much more resilient for white to first include the move c takes b5. By doing so, by no longer having a pawn on c4 for black to play b takes c4, this line won't work. So for example, if a takes b5, knight takes c5, rook d4, knight d3, since there's no longer a white pawn on c4 here, black cannot play the move b takes c4, winning a piece. So this move c takes b5 is a clever intermediate move that somewhat worsens this line. So let's go with this. As you guys may have guessed, this is how the game continued. After c takes b5, black really does not want white to play the move b6. So he's going to take that pawn back and lose the c5 pawn instead. And that will leave rough material parity. But if he's going to take on b5, should he take with the knight or with the pawn? Okay, so someone has suggested the pawn. This is a largely strategic decision. It's simply, do you want a takes b5 or knight takes b5? In both cases, knight takes c5 is coming next. And you have to essentially decide whether you prefer your knight on the c7 square or the b5 square. And ultimately, I believe knight takes b5 is a better move for two reasons. One, or three reasons, actually. One is the knight is simply more active on b5 than it was on c7. And two is that now this a pawn on a5 is not passed. In fact, white actually has a sort of backward pawn structure after knight takes c5. His queenside pawns are not very good at making a passer, while black already has a passed pawn on d6. Now, granted, that passed pawn is not going to be queening anytime soon. But, and the third reason is here, actually, black has a tactical resource at his disposal. So right now, the position is largely equal. I mean, the pawns, there's some imbalance in the pawn structure. But both sides, development looks about equal. Both sides, piece activity looks about equal. But black has a way to create some imbalances that are well in his favor. So let's see if anyone can find a nice tactical resource that he has at his disposal here. Okay, so someone has suggested the move rook takes e2. This is a very interesting move. It's funny, you're simply taking a bishop and you're losing a rook. But as it turns out, there's a fair amount more to it than that. So if white were to play rook takes e2, now after knight d4, this rook on e2 is hanging, or sorry, not queen takes d4, and so is the knight on c5. Because with the knight on the c5 is hanging specifically because this pin has been broken. This is relatively easy to calculate. It's just a one mover. You sacrifice an exchange, but afterward you have an exchange and a piece hanging. You're going to take one of them, and black will be left with a pair of bishops. That's relatively easy. However, a more pressing question is what happens if white plays queen takes e2? With the idea that now, in the event of d takes c5, there is some kind of disaster on the back rank. This has to be calculated accurately before rook takes e2 is played. But as it turns out, black can get away with this. So in the event of queen takes e8, rook takes e8 check, bishop f8, it looks like absolute death on the spot. But as it turns out, black's okay. For one thing, black's next move, if white does nothing, say a move like h3, black will start with knight c7, kick this rook, knight e6, kick the rook again, bishop b7, and absolutely everything in black's position is defended. The rook on e8 will be exchanged, and black will be left with two very good pieces against a pretty lousy rook, and he's completely winning. So white has to make something of this pretty quickly. But as we start calculating, we realize that concretely black holds together. So in the event of bishop h6, which is an attempt to simply win the game on the spot, he's threatening rook takes f8 mate. It's not too hard to see that the only move for black is bishop to b7. Now this rook is hanging on e8. And after rook a to e1, if white could make one more move here, he would play rook takes a8, bishop takes a8, rook e8, and white would win the game. But as it turns out, black can hold himself together here with the move knight to c7, which after bishop takes a8, rook takes a8, the e8 square is under control, and there's no way for white to get to the back rank. At the end of all this, black will have two pieces against a rook, and he's completely winning. Now, white can improve upon this variation a little bit. with rook takes a8 in this position, but this is very modest. After bishop takes a8, bishop takes f8, king takes f8, black again has 2 pieces for the rook. The only difference is here white wins a pawn as well. So he'll get a rook and pawn for 2 pieces. But nonetheless, I think white's position is extremely unpleasant after bishop c6, rook takes c5, and now knight a7. Because black's next move will be bishop b5, where the bishop is perfectly anchored. It's clearly holding off the 2-on-1 on the queen side. And after, let's say, I don't know, f3, bishop b5, black's next move then will be knight c6, which targets the weak a5 pawn. And it's going to be very hard for white to defend that pawn. Because if he moves the rook to the a file, the rook is extremely passive. If he plays b4, the pawn on b4 will need protection. And it's just a very difficult position for white. So that was not really what the doctor ordered. This all has to be calculated properly, but when it is, you achieve your goal. Now, here, after rook takes e2, white did not play queen takes e2 because he figured out it was very bad for him. And after rook takes e2, knight d4, you think about what happened to all of this. We spent a fair amount of time calculating very complex variations, and at the end, we achieved the bishop pair. This is not crushing. This is not like checkmate or some gross amount of material, but it's a clean advantage, and it's a positional goal that black was trying to achieve. So again, this falls back into using tactics to achieve modest positional goals. And you'll find that this is very common in the games of very strong positional players. And if you look at players like Karpov, he could calculate extremely well, and he used that to his advantage many, many times. It's just he was more known for his strategic decisions. So the game continued with knight e4. And now here I definitely could have taken the rook. And after queen takes e2, black has quite a pleasant position because he has a bishop pair on an open board, a somewhat better pawn structure, and maybe a small lead in development. But I thought I could improve upon this variation. I wanted to play the move d5 here, which kicks the knight and gains some space. But the problem is after knight to c5, this is a very good knight. It's on a nice outposted square. It can be supported. It's tying some of my pieces down to the defense of the a6 pawn. So what I did was something a little bit different. I played d5 in the original position here, attacking the knight on e4 directly. And my point was that if white were to play knight c5 here, if he were to play something like knight c3 or knight g3, then I would take this rook because I have pushed this knight away and he's not going to c5. And here, after something like knight takes e2, d4, white's in a very bad way. The bishops are really getting opened up, and the d-pawn is charging straight down the board. I think black's much better, maybe even on the verge of winning. So, but my point was that if white were to play knight c5 here I'm not actually going to take the rook, at least not right away. I will start with the move bishop to g4, which puts more pressure on the rook on e2, and it's pinned to the queen on d1 now. You have to notice that this little tactical resource, rook e8 check, aiming to take the bishop on d4 does not work, on g4 does not work because white has made it on the back rank here. So the only move white has at his disposal in this position is f3, but this is a seriously weakening move and one I'd be very happy to see. And in fact, black actually has a very nice tactical resource here that'll actually give you guys a moment to see if you can find. Black can win a very important pawn. Reading books will help you become a better chess player, but I don't think you'll ever become extraordinary without actual active training, like the kind of stuff that we're doing here. So knight takes e2 check is definitely a good move, and it's a clear improvement upon knight takes e2 in the previous line, specifically because black has provoked this pawn to f3, which really weakens white's king position. But black has an even better move, which is bishop takes f3. And the point is now after g takes f3, at this moment now black is down a rook for a pawn. That's a lot of material, but it comes back very quickly. So after knight takes e2 check, he takes the exchange back, queen takes e2, and now bishop d4 check. And here, if black is able to play bishop takes c5 next, he will remain up a pawn with much better position as well, because white's queenside is unimpressive and his king is wide open. So bishop e3, and this is where concrete calculation comes into play. It looks like white is consolidated, but black actually has a couple ways to get this over with. So queen e7 is probably the simplest option. It is attacking the bishop on e3. It is pinning that bishop to white's queen, so the queen cannot, the bishop cannot move. For example, bishop takes d4, queen takes e2, leaves black a queen up. It's attacking the bishop, attacking the knight, and white's losing material. White could try something like rook e1, and after queen takes c5, takes, black remains a pawn to the good, and with a much better position to boot, so he's probably close to winning. However, this is definitely good enough to justify bishop g4, but the move queen g5 check is even stronger, using this sort of pin on the queen that it cannot take the queen because of the pin to the king on g1. Now the bishop on e3 is hanging as well as the check, so white would have to try king f2, and now simply adding more firepower with rook e8 wins the game. This bishop is pinned twice. It cannot take black's queen because it's pinned to the king, and if it takes the bishop, then black can do a very strong in-between move, queen h4 check. If he were to make a mistake and capture the queen directly after king takes e2, white is left with too much material for the queen. But if he starts with queen h4 check and say something like king f1, and only now rook takes e2, after king takes e2, we have the exact same position as we saw just a moment ago, except the queen is on h4 instead of on g5, and as a result, we can simply play queen takes d4, and black is winning. So that's very effective. Now, my opponent actually thought that I made a pretty big mistake with the move d5, because he saw a funny resource. He realized that he is currently in exchange up, but I'm threatening an exchange and I'm threatening a piece. So he actually thought, what if I save my exchange instead of the piece? And he played the move rook to d2. Now I must take his knight. At this point, black has two pieces for a rook. This is a huge advantage. But here we see white's point, is that this knight on d4 is pinned. And now after rook a4, white is ready to take the knight on d4 with one of his rooks and ultimately equalize the material. In fact, when that happens, it will be black who's in trouble, because he will have had to trade off his g7 bishop. For example, if I were to give a variation like, I was considering something like rook a7, with the point being after rook takes d4, bishop takes d4, rook takes d4, rook d7, and trying to trade everything. Now after rook takes d7, queen takes d7, queen c2, and black cannot force a queen trade because queen d3 fails to queen takes c8. And next up, white will play something like bishop h6. Black's king is in a very bad way, and he might just find himself checkmated on the dark squares. And this is really not what black wants to have happen. So, in fact, my opponent thought he was doing quite well here, I think. But I had an idea in mind. So, in this position, the knight on d4 is hanging, and it seems like there's absolutely nothing to be done about it. But in fact, black does have a tactical resource here at his disposal. So let's see if you guys can figure out what that might be. Any thoughts on what black can play here? Yeah. So knight f3 is a very good move. Now, it's sort of an invisible move, because you think, well, the knight can't possibly move. It's pinned to the queen. But it is counterattacking with the king on g1. So white does not have time to take on d8 because it's check. Now, if white were to move the king, we take the rook. That's not happening. So white is going to take this knight. If he plays queen takes f3, which is kind of clever, after e takes f3, rook takes d8, check, white wins. But as it turns out, black has a very nice in-between move here, the desperado queen takes d2. At this moment, black is a piece up and actually completely winning right now, because both queens are hanging, and after something like bishop takes d2, e takes f3, black just remains a piece to the good and wins the game. So actually, white has to play g takes f3. And here, what's the consistent follow-up to knight f3 check? Anyone have the follow-up here? Right. So queen g5 is kind of automatic. Let's check. King must go to h1. And now black is down in exchange. Rook d8 check is threatened, and the pawn on e4 is hanging. Luckily, he has this move, bishop h3 at his disposal, which prevents rook d8 check because that square is now controlled. So if rook d8 check, black can take on d8, actually with anything. But let's say queen takes d8 is simple enough. It takes the rook and gets the queen out of danger. Rook takes d8 also worked. Here, that has been stopped. And actually, black is now threatening queen g2 mate. And it's not that easy to stop. The only legal move white has in this position is queen g1. Now, of course, black has no interest in trading queens right now because he's down material and the white king is open. So he plays queen h5, which is quite a strong move because the pawn on f3 is hanging. And, well, if black had one more move, he would play queen takes f3 with impending checkmate. So here, white had a few defensive ideas. The move he played in the game was not very good. But let's say white were to play queen g3. This move makes a fair amount of sense. He's getting his best piece into the game to try to defend against any kind of mate threats. However, black has a very strong move at his disposal in this position. Let's see if you guys can figure out what he should play here. I think someone asked why not rook c8 in this position instead of queen h5. The answer to that is that white can take the queen, and after rook takes c1, it's not actually mate because the queen can come back to g1. So going back to the way the game went, queen h5. Now white probably should have played queen g3 here. So I'm seeing some votes for bishop e5, which makes a lot of sense. We're attacking the queen and trying to push it away while bringing the bishop into the game. But unfortunately, white has the move rook d5. And now after bishop takes on g3, rook takes h5, g takes h5, h takes g3, white has survived the worst of it. Now, I wouldn't say that he's equalized. He still is struggling in this position, but it's not over. I mean, he's got an endgame with, well, black's pawn structure with two sets of doubled isolated pawns. This extra pawn is not really that impressive. This is probably defensible for white. E takes f3 has also been suggested, but here white again has several moves. Let's say he were to play the move rook to d1 with the point that this rook now defends the back rank and he's always ready to meet bishop e5 with bishop f4. Now, there's no doubt that black has very reasonable compensation for the exchange here, but he actually has a stronger move. So let's go back to this position. And one thing to remember always when you're attacking, and I cover this a lot in my series as well, is you should keep track of what the material count is if you've sacrificed something for the attack. In this case, black has sacrificed an exchange, and he's completely ruined white's pawn structure. So actually, if he could simply take an exchange back and semi-abandon his attack, he would just be left with a really good position due to white's terrible pawn structure. So there actually is a way in this position for black to simply win an exchange on the spot. Let's see if you guys can figure out what that might be. Yeah, so someone has found the move. Queen b5 is the best move, with a very nice fork. He is attacking the rook on a4, as well as a checkmate threat on a1. So for example, if this rook were to retreat, after queen f1 check, queen g1, bishop g2 is a pretty nasty checkmate, and one that white would not want to fall the victim of. The problem is, since the rook is hanging and mate is hanging, black did have to give up this h3 bishop, and that h3 bishop was the guy who was going to help give mate. He's the one like completely killing the king's escape route and controlling the g2 square. So black's not going to have a mating attack just yet, at least not easily. But after queen takes a4, if we look at this position, material is equal. White's king is wide open. His bishop on c1 is almost just lost. Like it's very hard for it to actually, it can't move and it can easily be attacked. The a5 pawn is hanging. Like everything seems to be going wrong for white. For example, if he plays the move king g2, trying to get off the back rank and lend some support to the pawn, black has a very nice tactical resource here, e3, blowing things up further. Now, if rook e2, black can play queen d1, and the rook and the bishop are both hanging. And if f takes e3 after queen c4, the bishop on c1 is hit, and if it is defended by rook to d1, black will play queen to e2 check, winning. So it's actually a very difficult position already after queen takes h3, queen takes a4. It might just be lost. I think white will lose at least a pawn here. I mean, if nothing else, the pawn on a5 is not going to get saved. So this is a very difficult position for white. And, well, I was certainly more than happy to play it. Instead, but I think that white, while it's a difficult, unpleasant, maybe lost position, it's not over. He can still play on and hope for some decent defensive chances. Instead, in the game, white played queen to d1, which was a bad move. Now, it makes perfect sense. White wants to defend the pawn on f3 in a more active way and potentially have moves like rook d8 check at his disposal. But black has a move here that ends the game on the spot. So let's see if you guys can figure out what black should play. Yeah, someone's got it. Bishop e5 is a wonderful multi-purpose move. It stops rook d5. It is gearing down on the h2 pawn, and it gives the black king a flight score in the event of rook d8 check. So with this, black's next move is going to be a move with this bishop, presumably bishop g4, which will threaten the f3 pawn. And once that happens, h2 will be hanging and very hard to defend. And the problem is the only move white has at his disposal to defend the h2 pawn is to bring the queen back to g1, where she just was a second ago. In this specific position, it simply leads to mate on the spot with queen takes f3 check. But there's really no other way to get any of white's pieces towards that pawn. So, and it's important to notice that if white moves the f pawn, say f4, attacking this bishop on e5 and opening up this line on the queen, is that after bishop g4 here, white does not have time to take the e5 bishop because the queen on d1 is hanging. In fact, white is simply mated after bishop f3 check next. Someone has suggested e takes f4, or f takes e4, excuse me. And this is well met by the move bishop to g4, attacking everything. Queen h2 is mate, bishop d1 is a queen, and bishop f3 is coming, and white has no way out of this one. So white simply finds himself checkmated. There's not much else to it. Now, there's I don't think there's really any other relevant moves. In the game, he tried rook a3 to add more support to the f3 pawn, but it wasn't really helping very much because black still has a win in hand. So let's see if you guys can figure out what that win might be. Black still has to be precise here, but if he finds the right move, he wins the game right now. So someone has suggested bishop g2 check, but in the event of bishop g2 check, the white king will run away. It gets to f1 and runs to like a2. Maybe you can get away with this somehow, but I don't see it happening because the king on e2 will be reasonably safe, and white sticks his rook on e3. He's ready for rook d8 check to trade off one of black's last attackers, and black is running out of pieces to give mate with. So bishop g2 is spirited but incorrect. Yeah, someone has suggested bishop g4. That's a much better move. So at this point, queen takes h2 is going to be mate. and there's really nothing white can do about it. He has to play queen g1. There's just no other move. If he plays rook d8 check, there will be king g7, and white does not even have time to take the rook in the corner on account of the mate on h2. So white tried queen g1 back, but now after bishop takes f3 check, white had to play rook takes f3. And at the end of all this, white has all the same problems he had before: an open king, a poor pawn structure, and black having much more active pieces. And he is simply a pawn down for nothing as well. So at this point, there wasn't much more to say about the game. White played queen g2. And there's no doubt that black can definitely keep the rooks on, or keep the queens on, excuse me. But I saw that I could simply trade queens and get an easily winning endgame, and I didn't think further. So rook c8 attacks the bishop on c1, which cannot actually be defended. White's only move is queen takes f3. But this brings my pawn to f3. And with a bishop on e5 and pawn on f3, the king on h1 will just never get out. There's just no way, because the h-pawn will... it doesn't matter if he moves the h1 forward, he still has made it on the back rank every time. So his pieces will be stuck on the back rank. And after rook d1, rook c2, attacking the f2 pawn, king g2, bishop takes b2. I am up 2 pawns for nothing, and I have a much more active position. So the rest of this game was not interesting, and we're not going to go over it. I did notice, though, that someone suggested to move bishop f1 in this position. And I think this actually would be a very serious mistake. So who can figure out what white's defensive resource is here that saves the day in the event of bishop f1? Right, someone has found the move. f4. This is a very important move to see. And the point is now, queen takes h2 check is prevented for one very important tempo, because the pawn on f4 is in between the bishop and that square. And the problem is, in addition to f4 stopping that, it also opens up this diagonal to the queen. So at this point, black, I don't think, actually can avoid an exchange of queens. If he doesn't have queen h3 here to give mate on g2, because I have a rook on a3 to scoop that queen up. And otherwise, queen takes h5 is coming, as is f takes e5 and queen takes f1, and black doesn't hold things together. So black would be reduced to something like bishop takes f4 here. Actually, here white can even go rook d8 check and take the bishop on f4 for free. Even if he couldn't, after queen takes h5, g takes h5. Black has some compensation here, but it's probably lost after something like this. Bishop e2, I don't know. It's bad news. If bishop e2, rook g1 check. No, black is completely lost here. So that is not what black wants to be doing. So it's very important to be precise throughout. After bishop e5, rook a3, bishop g4 is indeed the winning move that has to be found. So yeah, that game took a lot longer than I was expecting. We don't really have enough time left in the webinar to look at another full game, but I think I will show you a critical position from one game from the last tournament instead. So let me make a new board just real quick, and gives you guys a chance. So this was a game I played with Jeffrey Zhang, who's one of America's top juniors. And I really outplayed him very easily in the beginning, but then he found a very nice resource to complicate the game. Now, I was still much better, but he made it messy enough that it became complicated, and he was able to save a draw ultimately. But I'm going to show you the critical moment where I think he found a really good move. So the first part was quite interesting, but we're not going to go over it because we don't have time, and it's outside the scope of what I'm hoping to talk about. Takes, rook b8, bishop d2, bishop c8, knight b1, aiming for knight a3. Here, knight a3, rook b4. Now, in this position, I should have played rook b1. And if I do that, I think I'm more or less winning. But instead, I played bishop d2. Now, here, Jeffrey found a very strong move. So let's see if you guys can figure out what black should play here. And it comes back to the same thing of what is my plan? Why can I do it now if my opponent is stopping me? What happens if I do it anyway? So let's see who can find black's best move here. Okay, so someone has suggested 3 moves. Unfortunately, you only get to play 1. But the first move he has suggested is f5. Now, f5 is the move black wants to play here. In this sort of King's Indian structure, he has to get it going. The problem is if f5, he takes f5. And the pawn is simply lost because of the bishop on c2. And black is going to get his kingside blown up. So what he needs to do is prepare the move f5 somehow. And the most natural way to do that is rook f8. Now, rook f8 seems like a silly move because, well, if you look at white's last move, he had the f8 square under control. He retreated his bishop, allowing rook f8. But black doesn't have time for that because the rook on b4 is hanging. I mean, we can't just give an exchange. But that's when you start to think to yourself, what is my idea to play f5? My opponent is stopping me from doing it because, in this case, he is counterattacking something bigger. But the question becomes, what happens if I simply do it anyway? And actually, after rook f8, the position is quite complicated. Because after bishop takes b4, c takes b4. This knight is hit on a3. If it goes to c4, after knight takes c4 and a5, black has a strong protected passer on b4. He will play knight c5 next with excellent control over the dark squares. This c2 bishop is a total piece of junk. And white's rooks have no open files. I would say black's better here. Now, of course, white should not play knight c4. He will play knight b1 instead. But now after knight c5, black's pieces have gotten much better. White's rooks remain unimpressive, and f5 is coming. And black has a fair amount of counterplay. Now, in my opinion, he's still much worse. The exchange still matters. But this is a much better move than simply retreating the rook. Going back, if black had retreated the rook, and white had played something like rook b1, and is ready to play b4 next and bust open the queen side, he's going to win this race by a lot. Black is way too slow in his kingside counterplay. So this was another key example of the whole, I have a positional idea, my opponent stopped me from doing it, what happens if I do it anyway? And in this case, there was a positive answer. And Jeffrey came up with this, and as a result was able to complicate a position that looked really bad for him, and then played well after that to earn a draw in a game that really looked like he might just lose in 20 moves. And that's why he's a very good player. So in any case, I think that'll do it for this lesson. I'm just going to do a little wrap up. I'm going to stop sharing that and show you my gorgeous face once again, and just do a little bit of conclusion remarks. So first of all, I'd like to thank everyone who came out today. Just between all of us, I did not get paid for this webinar. I did it because I want to teach people how to play better chess. It makes me happy to see people coming out and learning from me. And I definitely hope that you picked up something from this little teaser. And the DVD I did, I really put a lot of work into it. And with 15 hours, you're going to see a wide range of positions, really from all kinds of positions, endgames, attacks, everything. But they'll all, the overlying lesson or theme that I'm trying to drive home is the same idea of if I have a positional idea that I'm trying to achieve and my opponent is stopping me from doing so, can I do it anyway? What happens if I do it anyway? What tactics do I have at my disposal to try to achieve it, even though my opponent seems to be stopping me? So I was certainly very happy to have done this. It was a real labor of love for me. I have to be honest. I underestimated the amount of work it would take when I agreed to do the project. But while it was really tedious to get through, I'm very happy with the final result. I'm glad I did it. I think it will help a lot of people become better chess players. And well, if it is successful in that regard, that will make me very happy. So I'm just going to leave a link in the chat down below in case someone wants to buy it. But let me just leave the link here. And that is, I think that'll do it for today. Thanks to everyone who joined me on their Saturday morning. And yeah, I will be in touch. I think I'll have another series coming out later this year as well. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a good day.